I come from 20 years as a therapist, sitting down with people in pain, sitting down with people struggling. And the Hoffman Institute is a week-long retreat. For the past 5 years, I've been a Hoffman process teacher, and it's a day-by-day step towards healing, very much immersive learning. And part of why I moved from private practice to the Hoffman process is because of the immersive learning. It's not an intellectual thing that the number of people, let's put it this way, the number of people who knew better and yet still struggled was very high. And so I thought to myself, well, what is happening that I can't help these people as much as I'd like to? And then I happened to do the Hoffman process and take it. And I thought to myself, I'm in the wrong profession. I've got to do this. And so then 2 years ago, as a part of a board experience in Washington, D.C., where I was born and raised, the board took on their work from a racial equity lens. And that's the framework that we began to adopt and look at things. And it was through that work where I realized some things that need to be shared, need to be talked about, especially my own process. And I'll share that a little bit as we go. So my word for the day is learn. Curious about what your word might be as we go through this experience. A journey with head and heart. Here's to no more disembodied learning, so that we can ground what's happening in our head, in our body, in our heart. To have those two separated is not always a great recipe for holding on to things, for learning. And I think about this question. What am I going to learn today about my own white privilege? What am I going to learn about myself? What am I going to learn about my blind spots? When am I going to stick my foot in my mouth? These are questions that I have as we start this day. And I just want to start with a story. So about 3 years ago, I was in a couples workshop for therapists. And we had the morning session. We go to lunch. I go through the buffet line. I sit down at a table with only one chair left. I don't know anybody at the table. The two people to my right and left, we engage in a conversation about what do you do as a couples therapist? What are you passionate about? And the African-American woman to my left says, I am looking at the work I do through a white privilege, social justice lens. And I'm curious, like, wow, white privilege. Whew, I haven't heard that term before. It feels provocative to me. I feel called out a little bit, a little uncomfortable. So I ask a couple more questions. What do you mean? She shares the story of her 6'5" African-American son not having the same benefit of the doubt as a 6'5" white guy. I think, yeah, that makes sense. I've gone to the School of Social Work. I get racism. I get systemic racism. And the white woman to my right is visibly uncomfortable. She says, you know, I just got to stop you. This thing about white privilege, what is it that you keep talking about color, about race? I've learned to see the world through a non-racial lens, to not see color. And there's a conversation between the two of them, and I'm uncomfortable. I'm thinking, this woman doesn't get it. She's not understanding what's happening. And then she says, you know, I have to say this. If Martin Luther King were alive today, he'd be rolling over in his grave. And I think, whoa. She's like co-opting King's message. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? Really, are you kidding me? And so I'm uncomfortable. I think I can't handle this. So I excuse myself. I exit. I go back to the classroom and check email and finish it. Just want to stop that story for a second. And then fast forward a year later, as a part of the board work I'm doing and the racial equity work I'm doing in this group. And they bring up that we're talking about white privilege. And here's one of the definitions that they share. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like discrimination. And I think immediately I flash back to a year before and that white woman. And I think, that's what it is. She feels oppressed. Wow. So I'm starting to kind of rework that conversation, rework all of what's happening. And then she talks about white fragility. And 2 years ago, I hadn't heard that term. She introduces it. And one of the many definitions she explains was when you experience racial stress and you can't handle it and you exit the conversation. And I think, holy shit. That was me. That was me. And I got goosebumps. Another thing she says is white solidarity. That one of the things of white privilege and white fragility is that you don't confront other white people on their racism. And I was like, wow, that's strike two. And so it was in that moment where I began to sort of piece together my professional life as a therapist, as someone who helps people heal, and this work related to racial justice. So that's part of what this talk is going to be about today. And we'll have great discussions. I'd love to have this be a part. There's a microphone up here. So white fragility, a couple different definitions here. Discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality or injustice. Robin DiAngelo says, a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves that include an outward display of emotions such as fear or guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation, which points right at me. So I saw this online in some of the work. White fragility is soft-minded and hard-hearted. And what about if we could flip those? To really engage in it with our mind, really, and be gentle and soft. And I'm going to work back and forth between the internal process of navigating an uncomfortable subject and the implications for that journey or that lack of journey. So here's Jesse Williams, an African-American actor. When you get everything that you want at all times, you complain what you don't get. If you're rich and you fly first class for the first 12 years of your life and suddenly you ain't rich no more and you got to fly coach, you're going to bitch about that. That's going to be uncomfortable. Something was taken from you. The thing is, we're not taking anything from anybody. Racism is not a black problem. This is a white problem. This is an American problem. This is a societal problem. And so one of the things about white fragility that perhaps should be at the top of the list is, I deserve comfort. I don't want to be made uncomfortable. And what I know to be true in learning and growing in the personal growth field is that is the exact opposite. We have to get uncomfortable. We have to wrestle with this stuff to really navigate it. So before I go to that, white fragility, I'm trying to think of an image that captures what we're talking about here. And this is the one I've come up with, and I'm open to adjusting it as we go. But white fragility and our inability to talk about it, to feel about it, to wrestle with it, is the cork on the bottle of justice. We can't move anywhere if we stay fragile with it. And so what I know here is that white fragility is all kinds of things. And I have a handout at the end. It's really a great Robin DiAngelo handout of what white fragility is and things you can do about it, and I'll put that in the back. But I wanted to open it up. I shared an example of my own white fragility, and I'm curious about examples that you know to be true for you. What are some ways in which you've seen white fragility? Whether it's in a placement, whether it's in class, whether it's yourself or someone else. Part of what I want to say is, it's normal. Like, it's normal. We live in a white-dominated society, so why wouldn't you have white privilege? It doesn't excuse it, but to deny it or avoid it is never the way through. So what do you notice about white fragility and how you've witnessed it? Can I get some examples, some shares? Come on, we can do this. Yes?
Well, I think that I think I'm able to drive my car and maybe not be stopped for no particular reason. That's privilege.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a strong form of white privilege. Was there also a hand here? Yes. It is. Yes.
Just from my own experience, so I was one of those people who was shocked and really hurt after the election last year, and went to the Women's March, and through those actions have understood and heard a lot of voices of my friends who were surprised that some of us were shocked, and whose voices came out about the inclusiveness of some of the protests and activities that have come out since the election. And so that's been something that I've had to face as well, is kind of the guilt of realizing the things that I didn't know, and bowing out of some conversations that I didn't feel prepared for, and realizing later that I would have learned more if I stayed.
Yeah.
So I've been living much of that in the last year or so.
Great, thank you for that share. You know, I in the work I do, it seems obvious, but it's worth saying, just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So often, I mean, it's our unconscious around racial privilege and white privilege. So often in the work that I do, I see people wrestle with this idea that because they're not aware of it, it isn't true. And part of my work is to help them say, it could be your unconscious, it could be something that you're not fully aware of just yet. So that's a normal part of it. And so just to keep going a little bit here, there's that white fragility on social justice. This is the piece, is white fragility is everywhere. Fragility is everywhere. Sometimes I think we end up like walking on eggshells around our own psyche. And what I know to be true is that when you run from that, you're never free. So part of what we need to do is get to know ourselves, understand who we are. So what's the antidote to fragility? How do we navigate this place? Here are 3 things that relate to the work that I do as it relates to helping people. And the first one is go towards struggle, not away. Go towards discomfort. Too often people try and be comfortable and go towards it. I remember when I was 15, walking into a bookstore with my family and coming upon this book, one of the best self-help, most sold self-help books out there, The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. His first sentence in the book is, "Life is difficult." And he says, life is difficult, and it's a great truth. The thing about it is that once you acknowledge and admit that life is difficult, it no longer becomes difficult. And this is so true of the wellness work, and that is that too often people feel like life should be easy. And I think we know this in the social work field, that you've got to struggle, you've got to wrestle with it. At times it gets messy. And when we acknowledge that and admit it and own that, then it no longer is a struggle. So here's to embracing the struggle, going towards the difficult with kindness, compassion for ourselves, for others. We live in a blame world, a world that loves to critique and judge and pounce, and oftentimes we adopt that in our own world. So self-compassion. And Kristen Neff, those of you, how many of you are familiar with her work, Kristen Neff? So she researches self-compassion. This is the thing she studies. And here's what she has found out, that she's at the University of Texas, Austin. She's found out that there's a lot of myths about self-compassion. But one thing it does is that it creates more resiliency. People are better able to take feedback because they can respond with self-compassion to themselves and be present to the feedback. More resiliency, quicker responsiveness. It actually requires strength, and it's powerful. It's not weak. It's not self-pity. It's not ineffective. It's incredibly effective. And it's a better motivator than self-punishment, despite our own ways at being critical of ourselves and critical of others. And it's not selfish. There's a deeper ability to focus and see others for who they really are. And I think that's the critical piece here about self-compassion and about this work, is that it's about you and your own work to make it not about you and your own work. Too often we think, well, I can't be self-indulgent, I can't make it about me, there's pain in the world, I've got to be present to other people. The problem with that is that you're not embodied and grounded in your own experience of yourself. And to do the work to understand who you are and your own reactions makes you better able to learn and grapple with this stuff. And the third piece of that is for the sake of something different. This isn't just being in pain. This isn't just being kind to ourselves for the sake of kindness. It's actually to get to the other side for a different outcome, for a new possibility. It not being about you, right? One of the indicators of white fragility is if we talk about our process. Yeah, I know you're in pain as a person of color, but I'm really wrestling with this. And too often, we can make it about our own process. Seems like we ping from denying that it's part of what we're struggling with to indulging as part of what we're struggling with. And then rewriting the story. I'm amazed in the work I do, the number of people who have a commitment to suffering, a commitment to being the same way. There's so much research around rewiring the brain. And this is part of helping us rewire our socialization around white privilege, living in this white world and not having it be an issue in us, in our world, because we can ignore it. I mean, the power of privilege is that we don't have to wrestle with this stuff. We don't have to deal with it. That's one of the very definitions of privilege. We're not forced to as white people. A new narrative. So this is why we go towards struggle. This is why we're kind to ourselves, because we want to create a new narrative. So just let's grapple with race a little bit. So the word grappling feels like, for me, a perfect word related to the work in mental health and in wellness and owning our role in the world, but also around white fragility. Engaging in a close struggle without weapons. That's the definition of grappling. And the first part, this close struggle is important. So one of the things I would ask that you do now is we're going to just take a moment and turn towards someone at your table and talk about ways in which you've engaged in a close struggle with something in your life. A moment of vulnerability here to acknowledge some struggle you've had. It can be about race and white privilege, or it can be about a struggle in your life and how you went towards it. So turn to the person next to you, give them a high five. Come on. Give them a high five. And start with a thank you. Start with a thank you. Good. As you bring your words to a close, close your eyes for just a second. Close your eyes and bring some kindness. As you close your eyes, bring some kindness to yourself for your struggle. Some compassion. And know that you are a learner. You're learning. Ken Robinson says the education system, you can open your eyes now, the educational system has stigmatized mistakes. And so often we want to know the answer. We want to know the answer. We feel uncomfortable with questions. So what I'm curious about is, what was that like for you? What did you share? What did you notice in sharing? What did people talk about? If we're going to do this, yes. Thank you for your courage.
I have two daughters that are adopted, one from Guatemala and one from China. And through the election of last year, it was hard for me. My next door neighbors were in support of our president and were in support of building a wall, yet they adore and support my children. So for me, it was a struggle to hear them talk positively about wanting a wall and feeling invested in that. Yet they were saying, hey, I'm going to take your kids to the movies. So it was an awareness that I wanted them to have, and I didn't know how to have that conversation.
Wow. And have you had that conversation?
No. They know where I stand. I've been more vocal about how I stand, but I have not been courageous enough to have that conversation.
Yeah. And their proximity as neighbors makes it in your face every day. Wow.
They're like family to me, so.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. That's yeah. You know, the notion of an ally, being an ally, we talked about that certainly when I was in the School of Social Work. And how can I be an ally to people of color? Certainly that day I wasn't when I exited the conversation and left. Another share of personal journey as it relates to what we're talking about? Yes. Thanks for your courage.
Of course. My name is Missy. This didn't necessarily come up in our conversation, but I think one of the things that comes to mind for me in my journey in understanding white fragility and my own white fragility is the impact that white fragility has on my colleagues and friends and people around me who are people of color who have to take on the burden of kind of receiving the white fragility, the guilt, the sadness, the tears, the pain we feel, and then how folks on the other side who are people of color have to hold that for us, and yet it becomes yet another weight. And I think that that's kind of what comes to mind for me when I'm thinking about my own journey.
Yes, thanks for that, because certainly part of the journey is not expecting people of color to educate you about their experience, being responsible for certainly in the last 2 years, the amount I have learned just by talking about it, by initiating conversation, by seeing the world through a different lens. And what I don't want to do is focus on strategy. Certainly that's possible, and we can go there and you can go there, but I think, and if you set yourself up to be open, to be engaged, then what you do about it becomes more clear. And I'll share a personal example of that a little bit later. Any other shares? It's really helpful, thank you. Okay. So, engaging in a close struggle. There's a real wrestling that needs to go on here. And I'll talk about Brene Brown in a second, but she says we live in a world that doesn't do discomfort. Like, we don't do discomfort. That's awkward. And wouldn't it be great to be like, okay, this is awkward, and lean into that awkwardness as a way of getting to the other side and learning. This second piece, without weapons, is equally as important. I think with social media and our ability to express without having to get feedback, we can fire away towards other people. It's so easy to rip out a post or an email. People so often type things in an email that they would never say to the person face to face. And it can be really a way of avoiding the discomfort. And also towards ourselves, kindness for ourselves and our journey. If this is the socialization, as Robin DiAngelo says, the water that we swim in, her metaphor is of one of water. We all swim in it, this whiteness. Then isn't it normal that we have to wrestle with it to undo it? And there's a term in the mental health world called spiritual bypass. And oftentimes we get spiritual bypassers who come to the process who say, I'm light and I'm love and I'm goodness. And it's like, well, what are you doing here? Or where's your struggle? And there's an avoidance there. And so I think a great place to start is that I struggle with this. This is something I struggle with. And that's why I started with the anecdote of my own failure around white privilege there. So when it comes to something that you want more of in your life, my suggestion is to find synonyms. So I threw in a couple here without weapons. Kindness, compassion, forgiveness, tenderness, gentleness for ourselves and others, as a way of really leaning into this, because it gives us courage. The people who are most kind to themselves can really step in and get uncomfortable. They don't make up a story about their own discomfort or their own struggle. So let me just ask this question and you can hold it. What's the story you make up when you struggle? What's the story you make up about yourself when you make a mistake? And what would it be like if you just gave yourself permission to make mistakes? Not to be sloppy, not to do your work, but that making mistakes for the sake of learning and growing. So often the people I see who struggle in the work that I do are people who are afraid. They're on the sidelines. And I don't know, this is too important an issue to be on the sidelines. This is too critical. And that's part of the reason I'm out here doing this, learning, growing, stepping into this, combining these fields of social justice work with our internal process. Grapple, engage in a close struggle without weapons. So the cost, what's the cost? I mean, I speak now as a white, heterosexual, cisgendered male. I mean, oh my God, really? Like, that's even painful to say. How can I both own my strength, my power, and at the same time acknowledge the cost of that? The cost of people who look like me and the damage we've done in the world. I'll talk later about my 12-year-old son and my 10-year-old daughter, but in particular my son, he's going to become aware, he is becoming aware of white men and the things that we have done in the world. But you know, just as I was putting this together, this came out. H&M, this clothier in Britain, the coolest monkey in the jungle. And they got a lot of pushback for this. And as I was reading about it, apparently it's not the first time that they have stepped sideways. This kind of, this blindness, this tone-deaf leadership. Certainly there's larger cost to a society that won't grapple. We love clarity. We love black and white. We love sidestepping the issue by saying, I'm not racist. And the impact on them as a company has been huge as a result of this. Economically, certainly from their reputation standpoint. So just a bit here about shame and white fragility, because I think it goes together. Here's what Brené Brown says. When it comes to shame, we all have it. And this, if we can go so deep as to wrestle with our own shame, we all have it. We all have it. Nobody wants to talk about it. I'm good. I'm good. But the less we talk about it, the more we have it. What about if we substituted white privilege for shame? If you're white, you have it. You have it. And you don't want to talk about it. And the less you talk about it, the more you have it. So, one more time, if you will, just connect with the person next to you. In what way do you have white privilege? And if you're a person of color, in what way do you experience the cost of white privilege? Couple minutes, go. So, what's it like? What was that like? What was that like to share? What was that like to hear? Somebody different. What was that experience like? Just think out loud, feel out loud. Yes. Thank you for your courage.
Thank you. Well, I'll say in our group, as I was talking about my own experience, which was in the past, I had to come to grips with how much I didn't do and I didn't act and I didn't learn because of protecting myself around white privilege.
So what was that like to come to that awareness around your own self-protection in the past?
Well, I mean, it was a long time ago, so it says, wow, how much I could have changed and done more and done better at the time had I been more open to what was really happening around me and to the messages I was getting.
Yeah. This is why I think we do the work, because our desire for self-protection lessens. We can swim a little more. It reminds me of in my part of the reason I started Elephant Talk, which is the elephant in the room, is like, let's have awkward conversations. So I brought couples together because what I saw in my private practice was that people were not having courageous conversation and they were having affairs instead. Or they were, in the case of one couple, one of my best friends struggled with cancer. And it wasn't until the very end that they sat down and had some great, courageous conversation. But the reason I shared that anecdote is because there was a moment when I was interviewing a woman on gender studies at Naropa in Boulder. And she was talking about gender and sexuality and describing her work around gender and the binary in the world that we live in. You're either male or female. And I just kept asking questions and asking questions. And at one point, I remember feeling dizzy. Like, whoa, wait a minute. That's where the term cisgendered, I understood through her. But it was a dizzying experience to enter into this world that I didn't know much about prior to the interview. And so that's why I think it's great to focus on that as a way of being more present to the confusing, unsettling conversation. That's a great anecdote, thank you. And maybe in moments, if we look at life in moments, sometimes, it's like, was it a great day? Did I have a good week? I think about that as a dad, like, how was my day with the kids? Or how was this week with the kids? And then I think, that's too much. Let me just look at moments. Did I get it right in that moment? Was I a good dad in that moment? And so often I think, like, in terms of this courage to show up without our white fragility, how did I do in that moment? Okay, good, thanks for that. Other examples of what that experience was like sharing? Thank you for your courage.
So, as a person of color sharing, it felt a little awkward, right? Because I think the costs of white privilege are pretty clear. I think we know them, they've been articulated. And so it sort of felt like, what's the value of my vulnerability and my pain in this moment? Like the parade of the pain of people of color, of Black Americans in particular. That's pretty well documented, right? And so for whom is that transformative in this moment? So in that way, it was interesting. It was like, what do I share here? Do I share, and are the stakes the same for me as they are for other folks participating in the conversation? So,
Wow.
Yeah.
And those are great questions. Any reflections on the stakes for you? It seems like the stakes are different for your share versus white people.
Yeah, I didn't really share, except to say part of the cost of white privilege are these kinds of conversations where people of color are asked to participate. The sort of terms are imagined as equivalent and they are not. And so that's part of the cost, is sitting at a table and there's this awkward silence when it gets around to the folks of color, like, are you gonna share? I don't know, is it the same sort of thing? And so that's my only reflection, is that this is part of the cost, is imagining where do we fit in conversations around addressing the problem, how do our needs show up there, and how do we practice self-care in the moments when white folks need to sort of work through what they haven't seen, right, or the moments that they've sort of lived in this kind of blissful ignorance. What does that look like for folks of color, right? How much, yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. When I did this, about 2 years ago where I had the experience, one of the things that the African-American facilitator said was, this is what he said. He said, white people need to stop thinking of themselves as good people by doing their own little volunteer work and their own little projects with people of color. They need to get together with themselves and figure it out. And I was like, oh God. Those moments where you feel like, wait, is he looking at me? Is he talking to me? So that's one of the questions at the end, how can we engage and grapple with this without having people of color be the teachers of it? The parade of black pain, I haven't heard that expression before, I appreciate that. Okay, moving on. So the key piece is here, we're not fragile. We think we're more fragile than we really are. And so here's what Robin DiAngelo says about her work. And I thought it was a great reflection for what it's been like for her. It's an ongoing and often painful process of seeking to uncover our socialization at its very roots. It asks us to rebuild this identity in new and often uncomfortable ways. I think that's the rebuild an identity. In a way, our identity as a country, as certainly as a white male, has been built on the backs of people of color, of women. And So if I'm not owning that reality and then rebuilding it on who I really am, not on my power over others, there's a lack of freedom in that. And if I can do it and understand who I am first and then get who we are as a society. And she goes on to say, but I can testify that it's also the most exciting, powerful, intellectually stimulating, and emotionally fulfilling journey I've ever taken. And so in the back are these sheets. And the first one is about seeing it from a mainstream framework. As you walk out, you can get it. And then seeing it from an anti-racist framework. It's a great cheat sheet for dealing with this head on and seeing our own white privilege. Okay, so just a couple calls to action. The first one is be a learner. So Eric Hoffer is I think he's deceased, but he's a sociologist. And he says that in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. And I wonder about the higher education field. We're all learned here in higher education, and maybe professors might be at the top of that. Certainly they study. And they're the knowledgeable ones. How can they still be the learners? How can we all still be the learners, embrace that learning role? The second thing is leave your comfort zone. So you see the learning curve there, the learning rate. You learn more as you get out of your comfort zone. And then that panic zone, which I think actually part of what happens is that white people get in the panic zone when they're not really in the panic zone. And so our learning zone is really narrow. Increase it. Deal with your own experience so that the panic zone is further off and you can handle that discomfort. The third thing is stay in your lane. And I loved this quote. And as a therapist, I can be particularly guilty of this. And I've seen it in white people as well, which is to focus on other people. And what I have seen in my own work is that people are often, especially in relationships, but in general, we become the experts on other people. Everybody can point out another person's patterns. It's much easier to point the finger and know what's going on there than it is to navigate what's happening inside here. And this is A.M. Leibowitz, who's, I think she writes on gender and anyway, so she says, this is literally what it's like to be a part of a marginalized group. Politeness is met with refusal to listen, and anger is met with demands for politeness. Oftentimes, I think part of what we need to do as white people is be comfortable with the message, however it comes, and not focus on the messenger. Well, if you were just more polite, I could get it. Well, if it feels like you're judging me, that's white fragility. Feels like you're calling me a bad person. It feels like you're being harsh. You're angry right now. That's white fragility. Part of our work is to not focus on the messenger and instead focus on the message and what we're learning. The third one is embrace humility. Be humble. Not always an easy one, but I have a guy I used to work with, Robert Hilliker, and actually Brene Brown knows him a little. Here's what he says. Keep your shadow right here, because the only way it can take you down is from behind. So I think about that in terms of white privilege. I'm going to keep it right here. I'm going to keep my foibles, my struggles right here. Not right here in the way, because then I can't move, but right there. Because if I try and pretend that, a woman, I forget her name, says that oftentimes what we end up doing is sending our representative to be in relationship or to be in this conversation. I don't want to send my representative. I want to be all of me And so owning all of who we are. Glennon Doyle Melton says, don't send your representative, be you. So embrace humility. And finally, my favorite word, be courageous. Be courageous. There's, Carl Jung says, our most valued spiritual possession is the paradox. The paradox. How can it be true that I do this work and yet I'm making mistakes? How can it be true that both things are true? Hold both things true. And oftentimes we struggle with owning two opposite truths. And certainly it takes grappling to wrestle with the idea that two things might be true. Yes, you're self-aware, and yes, you just said that. Okay, so just a more recent story as we wind down here. So my dad just turned 85, and we went on a special trip. It was down to St. Kitts, which is far away, feeling a little vulnerable as I tell this story because that involves certainly money to go down there. So it was a special occasion, and it was one of the ways we save money is going on a group trip. And it was beautiful, it was warm, it was over Christmas, it was great. But one of the things the trip didn't include was a stop at the local museum. So after the trip, my family, I have two brothers and a sister, we all have kids. My family stayed another day, is what we planned, and we went to the museum. And at the museum, they had an exhibit. It was a very local museum. It wasn't fancy, but they had an exhibit on the history of the country. And the history of St. Kitts, much like the history of so much, is based on slavery and oppression. And in that exhibit, there was a picture of a slave ship with a drawing of a slave ship in the bottom of a slave ship with people chained together. And the four of us come up to the exhibit, we're engaged with it, and my son asks, where did they go to the bathroom, Dad? And I said, they didn't. They didn't go anywhere to the bathroom. They went right there. And like he was horrified and I think disgusted and confused. And I sort of saw him in that journey. And my daughter steps away, and she's 10, and she steps away to go to the exhibit on the marimbas. And she starts playing the marimba. And I let her hang there for a little bit, and then eventually I went back, grabbed her hand, and sort of walked her back to the exhibit as it went on and as we moved on, sort of reminding her that, no, you can do this. You can do this. And I share that story about my kids because I think we all are hardwired to struggle and deal with struggle and be resilient. And I wanted them to struggle. I wanted them to feel uncomfortable because they can handle it. They can handle it. And so I asked this question of you, in what way can you struggle more with this? And by the way, just the final piece of this story is because oftentimes people say, well, what can I do? What can I do? And I'm not a big strategy fan because I say wrestle with it, grapple with it, and it's a creative process. What you do is unique to you. And so for me, I'm in that learning journey. This is part of it. Another piece of it is that I called the travel company and I said, look, you can't offer a trip and not go to the museum. You got to go to the museum. I put it in the feedback. I talked to somebody in a position of power. I said, it's worth it. And I said, it's not, you can't, there's something about, this is a whole nother subject, but there's something about going to a country and exploiting it just for one part and not its other part. And so I spoke, I tried to do something, but what you do will flow naturally from your own work. So I wish you good luck with that. And just a couple questions to think about. One is, how can you go towards discomfort with kindness? not go towards discomfort without kindness. You won't get very far. You'll abandon your process. Kindness is the thing that helps you hang in there through the discomfort. And the second one is, how do we create space for more grappling? I wonder, as a school of social work, as a school of education, how can we create space for more grappling so that it's not disembodied learning? I think one of the things about social work, it combines both. It's really perfect. And I thought about this: how can the University of Michigan School of Social Work be a leader in this grappling? There's something there. The field is wide open. There's not many people. Certainly Robin DiAngelo came on the scene with white privilege and white fragility, but it's new. Because in the past we've sort of been like, well, I'm not racist, so it's not really about me. And now it's like, well, you're white, so it is about you. And so how can the university be a leader to create space for more grappling? Because I don't think people know how to do that. I don't even think people know what that looks like. And then the third question is, how do we avoid a toxic culture? So how can we come together as a school? Because I think if we can't do it in the School of Social Work, we can't expect people to do it out there. There's something about, if we were to be able to do it here and create a learning environment here where we can do it, we can wrestle with it, and what that looks like, I don't know, but hold the question that how can the School of Social Work be a leader in this grappling? Because I think that story of you with your neighbor, if you could have experience wrestling with it, practicing it, then the neighbor conversation would naturally flow from that. You'd be inspired, you'd have ideas, you'd have practice, you would build your muscle for navigating that. Not easy, but certainly you'd build your resiliency around that. And again, that piece about the toxic culture, wow, it's dangerous. And so how do we, when we step into that, just back away? One other thing is that, so I know that I Am Not Your Negro is showing in a couple days. Is it tomorrow? Monday. In the beginning of that, I saw that a couple days ago, but in the beginning of that, Dick Cavett interviews James Baldwin. And the question he eventually asks is this. He says, I tried to get a video of it, but I couldn't. He says, is it at once getting better but still hopeless? It's a great question. But what he says before that question, in the 8 or 10 seconds, is white fragility like to a T. He says, why is it, I don't know, it's an odd beginning, but he said, why is it that black people are still unsatisfied? Why are you not more optimistic? Which is not a question at all. It's really a statement. Why are you not more optimistic? There's black people who are mayors. There's black people in sports. There's black people in politics, even TV commercials. And James Baldwin smiles. Like, you gotta be kidding me, is what it looks like to me. And Dick Cavett goes, well, I'm glad you're smiling. And for me, that is the epitome of white fragility. It's like, well, I'm glad you're smiling. And so I think that part of why I'm sharing that is because when we're in the present, it's easy to look back and say, wow, that's white fragility. How could he say that? But our own white fragility, we're on the edge. We're learning, like, things that I thought were normal aren't normal anymore. Things that were okay are not okay. So to be in this learning edge about our own white privilege right now is hard, is challenging. But on the other side is a deeper understanding, a more profound relationship with yourself, more trust. If you look at the resources page, there's the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Good stuff. It's a 2-day immersive workshop. Part of what they do is a 2-day immersive workshop. Immersive learning. You know, how can we create something here at the university where people dive in for a while because certainly getting up and bailing and leaving isn't helpful. So People's Institute, and then the Chattanooga Connected is a group of people coming together to just talk about race, to talk about it, to learn, to grow. So I leave you with that. I'm grateful to be here, grateful to continue my learning as I go about this. And my email is ajhorning@yahoo.com or andy@elephanttalk.com. I'd love to keep in touch, send you information, this stuff if you'd like, the slides. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks.